Welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's bad idea takes place on Air Canada Flight 143.
Don't think I've heard of this one.
I am ashamed that I had not heard of it, this one. It is a really cool story. This one's going to be a little bit of an unusual bad idea, Tony, because the bad idea is going to come at the beginning-ish of the story, and then we're just going to hear about a really cool thing that happened.
You saying this is strange is going to be overshadowed by the strangeness that's coming next week.
Okay, well, I look forward to that. But this week, we are taking it back to July 23rd, 1983. As I mentioned, we are on Air Canada Flight 143 with pilot Robert Pearson and co-pilot Maurice Quintal. And between these two gentlemen, they have a combined 22,000 hours of flight experience.
So two full-on masters of the trade, or craft.
Yes, Quintal, I believe, was around 7,000, so he hadn't quite reached that Malcolm Gladwell magic number, but Pearson is making up for it by a whole nother half of a mastery of being an airline pilot. These guys know what they're doing, and they are flying with 61 passengers and 8 crew members on a flight in a relatively new kind of plane, Tony. This is the Boeing 767-200, and the particular model that they are flying in at the time of this incident is only 5 months old.
That's pretty new in aviation terms.
Yes, and as sometimes happens when you have new technology, it doesn't always work the way you want it to. So this is as high-tech as a plane could, potentially get in 1983, and it had a new electronic fuel read system.
So instead of being like a little floaty thing that's mechanical, they actually have a digital readout now.
Yes, except they don't have a digital readout now because it's on the fritz. And this concerns Captain Robert Pearson. He knows that this is a real possibility of a problem. He wants to make sure he takes off with enough fuel. A plane doesn't take off with a full fuel tank, Tony, because fuel is very heavy. So if you fill a fuel tank up on a plane all the way and then you reach your destination with hundreds or thousands of pounds of fuel extra, then you've just lugged that fuel with you for conceivably no reason. You take enough and a little extra just in case there's some problems, and that's about it. And so Robert Pearson says, guys, I want you to make sure that we have enough fuel. And they do something called dipping the tanks, where they essentially stick a big pole down into the fuel tank of the airplane, look at where the fuel goes to on the pole, do some calculations, and figure out how much fuel is in the plane. And they don't do this once. They don't do this twice. They do this 3 separate times before Robert Pearson is comfortable taking off with this relatively new tech on this airplane. He says, I really want to be sure that we have enough fuel. And the ground crew comes back to him all 3 times and says, listen, buddy, we're sure you've got enough fuel. And Robert Pearson does the numbers himself and he says, yep, it looks like I've got enough fuel, and they take off. But they didn't have enough fuel, Tony.
So even with all of his expertise, all of his math, and all of these dipsticks, he still didn't quite get it right.
Not enough dipsticks, yes. And the reason that they got this wrong is going to tickle your heart to no end, Tony.
Yeah. Because
this flight takes place as Canada is switching from the English system to the metric system.
That's what happens when you forget about your feet, and gallons, and so on.
Well, in this case, it is kilos. Airplane fuel is measured in weight, as you would expect. Weight is a very big deal on an airplane. You don't want to have too much or too little. And so they are measuring this and doing the calculations with what they know about pounds, but they should have been doing the calculations with kilos, which means when they think they're taking off with 20,000 kilos of fuel, they're actually taking off with 9,000 kilos of fuel.
Yeah, I was going to say that's not even half as much as what they need.
And so cruising at an altitude of 41,000 feet, the low fuel pressure light comes on for the left engine. Now, this is a problem, but it's not a disaster yet. Maybe there's a problem with the fuel pump. There could be any number of things. Maybe the sensor is faulty. But, you know, Captain Pearson is pretty cautious, as we've already determined, and he also has somebody in his cockpit, Rick Dion, who is an engineer, a maintenance guy for Air Canada. And Rick Dion says, you know, it's possible we're out of fuel. Like, maybe we did the calculations wrong, maybe there's a leak, for whatever reason, maybe this light is coming on because the fuel in that tank is gone. And so Robert Pearson says, well, let's plan for that. Let's divert to an airport in Manitoba, Canada. We'll land there, we'll refuel, everything will be fine. And he notifies air traffic control of his plans to divert. He begins his descent towards this alternate airport. He gets to about 35,000 feet, and then the low pressure on the right engine comes on. Now, this is not going to happen. Like, you don't just lose both engines for no reason unless you happen to have not put enough fuel in your tank. And this is where the panic... Well, I don't want to attribute panic to Mr. Pearson, Tony, because he seems like a very level-headed guy. But this is around the time when the profanity is picked up on the black box, which we will not repeat here because this is a family-friendly show, but you can imagine the kinds of words that someone might start saying when both of their engines are running out of fuel.
What I'm trying to figure out is, did they just have new gauges that told them exactly how much they put in? Was this something where they weren't paying attention? Like, you'd think with a dipstick or whatever, like, they would actually be able to tell. Like, it's just weird. Where did the disconnect between the metric and the imperial system come?
It came because of the specific density of the fuel, Tony. And I know that because I read it, but I cannot remember what specific density is well enough to explain it to you. So that's a failure on my part. All I know for sure is that they didn't have enough. It's not like at the gas station, apparently, where you have a little meter telling you exactly how much you're putting in. Or if it was, that meter was in the wrong units too, and it also lied to them and told them they had enough.
All right. Sorry to divert. I was just trying to figure that out.
Well, it's a legitimate and reasonable question, but it's not one that I have more information on than I've already given you. I know that they checked it 3 times. I don't know what they used to measure it in the first place or why that would have been faulty. All I know is they're at 35,000 feet with no fuel. And at 35,000 feet, the left engine just completely flames out. It stops working. There is no action happening in the left engine. And so the pilots, again, I don't want to ascribe panic to these guys because they're both very level-headed, as we will see throughout this story. They get out the little checklist that they run through when they're going to have to do a single engine landing. And they call up the air traffic controller guys and say, hey, guys, single engine happening, kind of a big deal, get ready. And they're all sort of conferring back and forth. You can tell things are probably starting to get tenser on the radio now. And then, as they have locked in what they're going to need to do for a single engine landing, the right engine also completely fails out. There's nothing left.
You're talking about a plane with 80 people on it or around there, just completely a stone in the air at 37,000 feet.
Well, it's still got wings. It's a flying stone. They're designed to fly around. It's just a glider now.
Yeah, a very, very heavy glider.
And the amazing thing about this story is how many things, in spite of the main big thing that happened to go wrong, how many things happened to go right. And one of the things that happens to go right is that Robert Pearson, in addition to being a massively experienced airline pilot, also happens to be a glider pilot. Now, flying a glider that's designed to be a glider is somewhat different than flying a 767 that doesn't have an engine anymore, but he's got more experience than just a typical airline pilot would have with unpowered flight. And in fact, at this time, no airline pilot had any experience with landing a plane without engines. It just didn't get taught They thought, well, if you lose both engines, you're done for, so sorry. And to reiterate how uncommon this situation would have been, there is this bong sound that the airplane makes when all of the fuel is gone. As you can imagine, you build in like a, hey guys, there's no more fuel kind of a sound to really let everybody know that there's a problem. But neither pilot had ever heard that sound. Not in the course of actually flying planes around, and not even in the course of their simulator training. This sound was not present in the simulator because, again, they just didn't train people for not having any fuel left or any engines. If you didn't have engines left, you were dead.
And it's also like the software guy has to know about the tone as well. It's not like many people would ever hear that.
It would be very unlikely. And these guys, they draw the short straw on this one, and they are now in this glider with engines that do not work. Now, in addition to all of the other things that you might consider would be a problem in this situation, like not being able to push the plane forward through the air, there's another complication that arises because the engines have failed, and that is that now there is no power on this plane. Because the power that the plane would run on is run off of the engines and the fuel that they have now run out of. So Captain Pearson deploys an emergency backup system called the Ram Air Turbine. And what the Ram Air Turbine is essentially is a fan that you crank out of the side of the plane, and because you're moving through the air, it spins the fan and it gives you some limited power. It's actually hydraulic power, not electrical power, and hydraulic power is what you would use to fly the plane. You need power to move the control surfaces, the rudders and the flaps on the wings up and down so that you can tell the plane where to go. And so he's getting this from this backup power generator, the Ram Air Turbine, which works less well the slower that you go.
And also is creating more drag for your plane, so you're slowly limiting how far you can go with that, too.
Yes, but the bigger problem is you're going to want to land. And when you land in an airplane, you don't want to be flying at top speed. But as these guys slow down to be able to come in for a landing, they're going to now have less control over the airplane because the hydraulic power is going to be less and less and less as the airspeed drops. Now, all of this is immaterial if they don't have somewhere to land. And here comes coincident number 2, because co-pilot Maurice Quintal realized they weren't far from the Royal Canadian Air Force Base in Gimli, where he had trained in the Air Force to become a pilot in the first place. And he says to Captain Pearson, hey, why don't we go there? It's not that far. We can make it. I know these runways pretty well. I've landed on them a bunch of times. That'll be a good backup plan. And they radio this to the air traffic controllers. And it's interesting because neither the air traffic controllers nor Robert Pearson have information on this airway. It is not in their list of places that you could potentially land. It's literally just off the top of Quintal's head that he knows the area and knows this airspace and knows where they can land. And it's the only place they can go. And the air traffic controllers are like, listen, you guys got about 17 minutes because they're losing 2,000 feet of altitude every minute that they're in the air. So the clock is really ticking. On top of that, air traffic control no longer has a transponder that's working in the airplane to see where this thing is because that was powered by those engines. So they're literally laying a ruler on top of the radar trying to figure out, based on what they know of the plane's position, where it has gone to and how much space the plane has left before it gets to this last-ditch effort runway.
So what are the people in the back doing at this point? Like, do they know that there's something severely wrong, or that they just heard that they're coming in for an emergency landing?
I would imagine that the fact that it's now very, very quiet in the airplane has probably tipped a few of them off that something might be wrong.
Yeah, you wouldn't have any of the air conditioning coming in. You wouldn't hear the engines. You wouldn't hear anything. It would just be wind noises outside the plane.
Yes, I don't have any original testimony from people who were on the plane at the time that I got in my research, but I think that they have an inkling that there's probably something going on. But they just have to trust that Robert Pearson is knowing what he's doing, and fortunately, he does. What he doesn't know, and what Quintal doesn't know either, is that this airbase that Quintal trained at years ago is no longer functioning as a Royal Canadian Air Force airbase. It is now a go-kart track.
So they're going to land this thing on a go-kart track.
Yes, on Family Day, where all the families would gather around the go-kart track to watch their kids race go-karts.
So they're sitting at max capacity. Everybody brought their own their own thing of like Canadian fried chicken, and they're going to try to land a 767 on this thing.
You got it, Tony. You see why this is such a great story?
Just making sure I've got everything in line here.
Oh, it's so good. Now, in addition to all the other problems that not having engine causes, one of the things that they have to worry about is that their landing gear will not normally descend without power. So they have to do what's called a gravity-assisted drop, where normally you would have your hydraulics drop your landing gear out of the bottom of the wings and out of the nose of the plane, and that would be what would catch you, but they don't have that in this airplane anymore, so they just have to sort of let it go and hope that it latches into position. And they make their approach to this runway. And there's a problem. I know, another one, right? In addition to all the other ones that they've had, Robert Pearson realizes that he's too high to make this landing happen successfully. The plane is too far off the ground. It needs to lose height. But if he pitches the nose down, it will gain speed, which will make the landing much less safe. It might jeopardize the safety of everybody on board. So he has to come up with a way to slow the plane down without the use of most of his control surfaces, because he's already going pretty slow and the Ram Air Turbine is doing not much for him, and also without increasing the speed too much and killing everybody on board. And it just so happens, once again, that Robert Pearson is intimately familiar with the maneuver that he needs to do to slow the plane down. It is called a forward slip. And the forward slip is essentially equivalent to drifting a car, where the plane is going to continue traveling forward, but it's going to be slightly at an angle to the direction that it's facing. So the body of the plane will catch more air and slow down more. And Robert Pearson had done this maneuver many, many times, because not only was he a glider pilot, but he also would tow gliders up into the air so that they could do their flying around thing. And when he would be on his way back, he would have a tow hook hanging out of the bottom of his plane, which could catch on the fence of the airfield where he would land. And you don't want to catch your tow hook on the fence of the airfield, because it's either going to mess up the fence or mess up the plane. So he would regularly do this forward slip maneuver to go over the fence and then lose enough speed to land on the runway. And he does this again in this giant 767. He never sees the people on the runway. He is so focused on the details of just what he needs to be able to do that he is completely blocking out every piece of extraneous information, including the presence of spectators on the runway.
This is something that happens in an emergency situation called tunneling. I was just listening to Charles DeHig talk about it, and most often when tunneling happens, pilots end up having something where they don't pay attention to their instruments anymore. It sounds like he had it pretty well in control, but it's a major problem under these situations of full duress, where you can just be focused on something and not notice everything else.
And to be fair, if he does notice it, it doesn't do any good. It's not like he can turn in a certain way that will stop him from running into the runway at this point. Quintal, the co-pilot, does see that there are people on around the runway, and he just keeps his mouth shut because he's like, if I say something, it's just going to make things even worse. It's going to throw him off his game. He's doing a great job. We're just going to do the best we can and pray for no casualties. And you have to think of what we already mentioned earlier, Tony. There are no engines, which means there is no sound coming from this airplane. The spectators at this airfield, there for the go-kart races, if they see the plane, they are seeing it because they see it. There's no audio cue at all for them to notice this plane coming in. And yet, somehow, miraculously, nobody gets hit by this 767. Somehow Robert Pearson is able to land this. As he touches down after the plane is on the ground, he starts to see other stuff around him, including a couple of kids on bikes that are like 1,000 feet in front of the plane. And they've just got this giant behemoth of a machine bearing down on them. And Robert Pearson slams on the brakes as hard as they'll go. The landing gear in the nose of the plane collapses because it hadn't locked in place from when it did the gravity drop, which drags the nose of the plane on the ground. In addition to all of this, Robert Pearson realizes that there's a railing that's built along the side of the runway. This was installed for when they did drag races at this airport after it was converted. And he steers the plane into this railing to create even more friction. So he's slowing down as fast and as hard as he can. The plane comes to a stop and nobody is injured.
That's pretty incredible.
It's so incredible. I could not believe it when I read this story. I mean, I can't believe Michael Bay hasn't made this into a movie, except for that it's about Canadians and, you know, Michael Bay and America. But, I mean, the two kids on the bikes with the giant plane coming in and the silent behind them is, like, hitting the ground and the sparks flying up. It's awesome. It's so cool. They sustained, like, 2 injuries because the angle of the plane is weird, and so when the people go down those cool inflatable slides that they have in case of emergency, the slides in the back of the plane are actually relatively high off the ground, so some people fall off of those and get hurt a little bit. But those are the only injuries sustained as a result of this terrifying, amazing, heroic feat.
I think I'd be willing to accept like a busted ankle from a slide a lot more than what could have happened on that flight.
It's one of the most impressive incidents of this kind that I've ever heard of. I was so blown away by all of the ways that everything came together in such perfect harmony that somehow, like, the hand of fate, like, reached out and said, no, this plane will not crash. This man will have all of the experience and all of the know-how that he needs right there at his fingertips. And somehow, Robert Pearson and Maurice Quintal managed to pull this out. And to top it all off, the front of the plane catches on fire, and Robert Pearson grabs a fire extinguisher and personally jumps out of the plane and puts out the fire in the front of the plane with his own personal fire extinguisher.
It's like he just couldn't be done that day.
And that is the amazing story of the Gimli glider. The bad idea this week is the metric system. Y'all are all dumb. English is the best. Screw being able to convert one thing into another. 5,285 feet for a mile is how I will be going.
That's just 5,280. It's not the extra 5.
It's so easy. That is all I have for today, folks. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed hearing about it as much as I enjoyed learning about it. This really does need to be a movie. I think that there is a TV movie that came out in the 90s or something that was loosely based on this. But the fact that this really happened, and I haven't heard of it before now, that's happened to me a lot in the course of studying for this show, Tony. I love...
Yeah, Bad Ideas has expanded our worlds quite a bit for the weird and interesting things that we have never heard of.
And that is something I am intensely grateful for, to have been able to read about this story and hear about it, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it too. We will see you guys next week with another episode of Bad Ideas. If you have bad ideas you want us to cover, send them on over to our email at badideashow@gmail.com. Take care, y'all.
Bye, everybody.